All right, good morning everyone. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast, and we are really glad you decided to join us today. This is Matt Ipri from Decision Lens, and we are excited to host another of our webcast series featuring one of our great customers and clients today, Jim Fuller from DHRA. We are glad you joined. Our event today is on a topic that is probably near and dear to many of you, as there isn't really an organization I've heard yet that doesn't engage in some kind of strategic planning. And more often than not, it's often viewed as a struggle term or a hard term or a term that causes more odds than it should. And why I'm excited for today is that we've got a lot of organizations that are really making smart inroads to improving their strategic planning and showing that they can get started with it easily, and that you don't have to be perfect the first time you try to do any strategic planning. And so I'm really excited to get into it today to talk about it. Specifically, we're going to talk about strategic planning in many different forms. So we're going to talk about the different ways you define your strategy and align to it to start with your strategic planning. We're going to talk about the way allocating resources and working with stakeholders and doing collaboration, all these things that are part of it. But more often than not, we're really hoping you walk away with the feeling that it is okay to get started and it's okay to not be afraid of not getting it perfect the first time you do anything. Couple notes on logistics before I get into the topic and the agenda today. We do want to hear your questions. We are live today and we'll be answering as many of your questions as we can. So please give us your questions. Put them into the chat screen to Maddie Scott, the host. She's the only name you can actually see there. But if you see the little chat button in the upper right, click that and put in your question to Maddie Scott. We will get it and we will answer as many of those as time allows at the end. If we can't get to your question, no problem. We will review it and we'll try and get you an answer via email or otherwise when we're done the event. Second logistic thing, since I know many of you will ask, yes, we will definitely be sharing a copy of these slides when we're done. Even if someone registered and couldn't attend, we'll be sharing those slides with you or with them, so no need to worry about it. And we definitely encourage you to share both the slides and the recording that we send to you with your colleagues who maybe weren't able to join today for sure. And then time-wise, we hope to be done by about 10 to 1. That's East Coast time, but in about 45 or 50 minutes from now, making sure you're out before the end of the hour so you can set your time accordingly. All right, so table of contents-wise, we're going to sort of break into three quick sections today. Our first speaker, Karsten from Decision Lens, who I'll introduce in a minute, will be sort of getting a bit of an overview about strategic planning, especially in public sector arenas, and some key themes we're hearing and seeing a lot. And then our guest speaker from DHRA will take us through his situation, his environment, the work they've done on strategic planning, and the great successes they've had as they've gone down this path and this journey. And then Karsten will come back and walk through a bit of the big themes, big principles, big best practices we're seeing as an organization in and around strategic planning, and again, especially in the public sector. That's what we'll cover through, and then we'll get to Q&A at the end as we go. All right, so I've mentioned their names briefly, but look, we are really proud and honored to have two great speakers with us today. First and foremost is Jim Fuller. Jim is from one of our longtime and great customers from the public sector, the DHRA, and Jim's role is in Program Analysis and Evaluation. He's been working with strategic planning and really planning efforts in general for a long time, and has been working with Decision Lens for some of that time, and we're excited to hear his anecdote and his story. I'll let him introduce himself a little more later. And then we've got Karsten DuPont, who really runs our federal implementation team. Karsten's been with Decision Lens a long time, and all of our federal and especially our DoD organizations, Karsten's been intrinsically involved in making sure they're successful with their planning and their alignment and their resource planning. And so I'll first turn it over to Karsten to get us started and to talk about strategic planning in general. So Karsten, all you.
Okay. Great, thanks very much, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. Just to follow up with a very quick background, I came to Decision Lens from the Pentagon, the Navy Strategy Office, as a government employee, where we actually worked with Decision Lens in support of a developing and sort of nascent strategic planning process. So since that time, for the past 5 years at Decision Lens, I have been working with multiple federal agencies in support of those processes. So it brings some of that perspective to this discussion today. And I'm going to start with just a very short lead-in to Jim's presentation. I'm just going to talk about a couple of key themes. We're often working with federal agencies and of course with other industries as well, who are looking to institute new or enhance existing strategic planning processes. So we've seen a lot in working with these organizations. We've noted common themes, common challenges, and considerations, and we'll discuss many of those today. Jim will address those specifically from the DHRA perspective, and we'll talk about those also a little bit in general terms. But just put very simply, and of course this doesn't do it justice, these statements of, what is strategic planning? It's the alignment of resource allocation decisions with an organization's objectives. That's a very handy, concise statement, but there's a lot that goes into that. Again, we'll be talking about that today. How does strategic planning help? It can focus an organization more clearly and enable better investment decisions. Again, a concise statement that we'll dive into more over the course of this webinar. Just to briefly note some of the additional benefits of an effective process of this type, some of the more fuzzy or qualitative things: transparency, rigor, repeatability. These can be sometimes added benefits or byproducts of a mandated process. They may also represent more primary objectives in terms of improving your organization's process and efficiency. So as I get ready to hand this over to Jim in just a moment, just a few wrap-up comments here to kick this off. Strategic planning is absolutely worth doing. It has some inherent challenges, of course, but they can be overcome. Organizations, as we've seen, may work through some of these common challenges, and a lot of it's about taking bite-sized chunks, having and following through with a plan, engaging stakeholders in the right way, and you can certainly work through those common issues. A short list here. Some of the sources of those challenges can be, for example, the complexity and the nature of the organization and its mission, insight or lack thereof of the actual portfolio. We'll talk a fair amount about, at least in the time we have, about assessment mechanisms and some thoughts about different ways to assess investments and programs. And enterprise mentality, that may in itself just be a shift from a more siloed perspective. And then finally, organizational buy-in and acting as advocates for change. That has an inherent sort of flow through the entire process. So with that said, we look forward to hearing from Jim. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Karsten. As Matt said, I am a program analyst in the Defense Human Resources activity. I've been in DHRA about 15 years. My background prior to that was Army. I'm sort of an ops research comptroller kind of guy. So I've been involved in resource management in one form or fashion for probably longer than I'd like to admit. I'm really stoked about being here, to be honest with you. We feel like we've had a good deal of success. I don't know if it's great success as Matt described, but it's certainly it's incremental, and we think we're on the right path. We're grateful for the opportunity to talk with you guys about this, and we hope you find some value in what we have to present. I'd also say that we've sort of only just begun on this journey. We've been working on it for quite some time. We've made a little bit of progress, and we'll talk to that in detail. To sort of provide an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I want to first set some context for you, because the Defense Human Resources activity is a pretty eclectic group of organizations, and I think you have to understand how we're put together in order to understand some of the challenges that we face. Once I've set that context, then I'll talk about our objectives, players in the process itself, what our outcomes were, and where we're headed. So I'm going to jump right into that. The Defense Human Resources activity is a field activity under the purview of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. So I need to sort of set that context. The USDP&R is a principal staff assistant to the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Total Force Management. I've seen who the attendees are. I realize a lot of you are not from Department of Defense, so I sort of want to tell you how a defense field activity fits within the DoD framework. So DoD is made up of services and defense agencies and defense field activities. The defense agents, you know what the services are, but the defense agencies and field activities are formed to have a special purpose to support the armed services. So we have a defense agency for education. We have a defense agency for logistics. We have a defense agency for medical care, those sorts of things. DHRA is a field activity. We're a little bit smaller than an agency. But we're the designated arm for personnel and readiness to provide systems, data, applications, policy support, decision support, information for many of the aspects of the human resources management across the total force. So I want to provide a little bit more detail on that for you by talking about the way we're put together, and I think it will give you an appreciation for the variety of things that we do. So if we could go to the next chart. DHRA is made up of a headquarters and 9 components. And we're about a $900 million a year operation. We got about 1,200 people, predominantly civilian. We got about 35 or 40 military. And we have a significant number of contractors that support us because a lot of what we do is related to information technology, and that's where a lot of the expertise exists. I want to sort of go through these components left to right, top to bottom, just to give you a feel for what they do. I don't want to go into too much detail, but so we have a Defense Manpower Data Center. They make up almost half of our budget. They got about 375 people, and they are responsible for maintaining the data and the applications that we use to do the HR business. The Defense Personnel and Family Support Center is a new component that we've created that has several piece parts. It has our computer electronic applications program. They provide, or accommodations program, I'm sorry. They provide accommodations for people who have some sort of physical disability and need an accommodation in order to do their job. They provide that for the department as well as organizations outside the Department of Defense, but within the federal government. We also, in that component, is a voting assistance program. So we have voting assistance. Also is a transition program for military members to transition to veteran status. We also have what we call our Employee Support to Guard and Reserve. It's an organization that tries to ensure that the reserve members and their employers are on the same page, and finally we have a yellow ribbon program, reintegration program, that is designed to help the services reintegrate reservists and National Guardsmen who deploy to a theater of operations and come back into the civilian community. So that's a pretty varied portfolio there. The Defense Civilian Personnel Advisory Service basically provides policy and advice relative to management of the civilian workforce, and they also have a significant element called the Investment Resolution Division. Within a population of 400,000 plus or minus civilians, we have ongoing issues that need to be resolved, just people issues. The Office of Personnel, or People Analytics rather, is our ops research capability. It's a newly formed component. The Office of the Actuary is our smallest component. It's about a $2 million operation, 10 people. They do actuarial stuff, and I'll leave it at that. The Defense Travel Management Office oversees our defense travel system and our defense travel process. They establish travel policy. They are probably our most active component in terms of identifying major savings that the department can accrue from changes in travel policy and that sort of thing. Our Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office and our Defense Suicide Prevention Office are sort of the same thing. At least they have the same sort of programs, which are oversight of the way the services do things, outreach to a particular part of the population, and education programs. The difference, of course, is their focus. SAPRO is focused on identifying sexual assault and resolving it and preventing it. The Defense Suicide Prevention Office is focused on preventing suicide. And finally, the last component is the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. DELENCIO is responsible for building and maintaining an inventory of linguists and ensuring the department has the linguists that it needs to do its job. So I hope that gives you some understanding of the variety of programs that DHRA is responsible for, because that dovetails into the following slides I'm going to talk about, where one of our major challenges is getting one organization to understand what the other organization does, and not only understand it, appreciate it, and not only appreciate it, but able to somehow put it in a hierarchy that is manageable. So I'm going to go to the next slide and sort of, I'm going to go off script a little bit. These guys told me I could do that, so I'm going to do it. As you see the slides that follow, you'll see that we talk a lot about what we have done and who the players are and how we have gone about doing something. But it occurred to me at about 3 o'clock this morning that there was an omission in my presentation, and it was really the why. Why have we tried to identify all the things that we do, and why have we tried to set some sort of priority relative to those things? So I want to relate a little bit of an experience. I became the DHRA Resource Manager, Chief of Resource Management Directorate in the summer of 2010, and the first decade of the 21st century was pretty good for DoD. We saw a lot of growth in the department. We saw a lot of growth in the resources for DHRA, and then pretty much at the end of the decade, the then Secretary of Defense Robert Gates implemented a zero-based review, and I think he was concerned with the way that the department was growing, and we needed to identify some efficiencies or places where we could reduce resources. So we plunged into that without having a prioritized list of anything, and we were on the cusp of being about $1 billion a year business. As a result of that zero-based review, we took a reduction of about $140 million a year. That was largely foregoing things that we had planned, but it also involved the reduction of our personnel footprint. And as we got by, we met the numbers, but we didn't optimize what we had done. So we realized at that point that we had a portfolio of things, but we didn't have them prioritized. We could go in and identify things that we might not want to do, but it really was suboptimal. And in the years since 2010, what the department has seen pretty much on an annual basis is a reduction in the resources that we have available, and we knew we had a need to somehow do better than we had done in 2010, somehow do better than just taking a 10% reduction and salami slicing that reduction across all our components. We had to do a better job of figuring out what was most important and what was least important, and how we could make more optimized resource decisions. So that's what we did. We embarked on a process to define, understand, and prioritize a portfolio of very disparate parts. Also, we got a new director about a year and a half ago, and we'll talk about this in detail a little bit later, but he wanted to create a governance construct within DHRA so that we were more open, we were more transparent, we were more inclusive in what we did. So we sort of found ourselves about a year and a half ago at a point where we had to figure out how to prioritize all these things, and we had to sort of shoehorn that into a new corporate governance structure. So what I'm going to talk about is our challenges relative to that, the players, the process, what came of it, and what we think we need to do for the future. So I'm on the slide that talks about what question we were trying to answer. I've sort of alluded to this. What we really wanted to be able to do was take a. I use the term guy. I'm from Eastern West Virginia, Western Maryland. Guy means Ewans in Western Pennsylvania. It means you all south of the Mason-Dixon line. But what we wanted to do was take a guy who spent his life, not his lifetime, but a significant part of his career building a language inventory and have him somehow understand what the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office was all about, and what laws dictated what they did and that sort of thing. So our biggest challenge as we embarked on this was, how do we get everybody to understand what everybody else does? You'll hear me refer to this throughout. The challenge of cultivating, infusing people with an enterprise perspective. And I will tell you that we have only just begun that. That is probably the biggest hurdle we've had to overcome, is having people understand and appreciate what other people do. We wanted to level the playing field so that we could prioritize what we do. We wanted to be transparent and inclusive in everything we do. And honestly, that is something we had not done very well until our new director came on board. And I think we've gotten better at it, but we have a ways to go. And then finally, we want to know how we can replicate the process, how we can improve the process. So those were the questions that we were trying to answer as we embarked on this little exercise.
So Jim, if I may, just and this is actually a fairly tactical question to give a little bit of a particularly concrete element of what I've seen you progress through in this process. When you talk about these words, agility and a continuously changing environment, do you mind talking for a moment about the way that your assessment mechanism, in our case, it was the decision criteria, how those evolved over a particular cycle, and how you experienced that, what benefit you saw from that?
I can sort of talk to the false steps and lateral movements first. Our first approach to develop the criteria on which we were going to prioritize things, and I hope this answers the question, was to do what people typically do. I think, let's get a bunch of people together in a room and let's put a blank piece of paper on the wall and let's try to figure out how we're going to prioritize things. And I don't know if that was an abject failure, but it wasn't a major success. What we found is that, and really working with Karsten and the Decision Lens folks, we found that we had about, 12 or 15 criteria that we thought were important, and we learned early on that that's just way too much stuff to ask anybody to deal with. So we were able to narrow that down. We narrowed down the group of people who would ultimately develop the model, and developed a sort of a straw man to take to people, as opposed to trying to go with a blank sheet. So I think we learned that lesson maybe the hard way. We learned it pretty early on, but I hope that answers the question.
It does, and the reason I bring it up here is I do think that was representative of a natural progression that we often see in terms of developing a decision model, a set of criteria that are important to prioritizing investments or programs. But we often see, and so your case was actually very representative of a natural evolution through that. Starting with the idea is that there are more elements that we need to be concerned about, and fundamentally learning over time and through a cycle or so that the core questions or the core set of attributes or criteria is a smaller set than that. So I just wanted to flag that point.
Yeah, I hope that's a teaching point for everybody on the other end of this thing, because if we had it to do it over again, we would have done it smarter. I want to talk a little bit about our players, and I want to talk mostly about our director. As I said, our director came on board about 1.5 years ago, and he came to us from the Air Force. So he brought an Air Force perspective to things, and as I said earlier, I came from the Army. I have an Army perspective. My boss, the director of PA&E in DHRA, comes from the Navy, and she has a Navy perspective. And it's common in the services to have a pretty mature prioritization listing. One of the things that I think surprised all of us as we got the DHRA is that didn't exist. So our director came to us from the Air Force, so he had that in mind. And we say this a lot when we're talking about how something will succeed or fail. And it may seem trivial, but it's true. If you don't have a director who wants to get something done, if you don't have the leadership backing, you can do all the analytical kind of stuff you want to do, but you just can't get there. And we were fortunate enough to have a director who is dynamic, who is visionary, and is not afraid of the D word. He's not afraid to make a decision. And so often what I have seen is people are sort of paralyzed by not wanting to make the wrong decision. They won't make any decision. And Mr. Booth is not that kind of guy. He is a guy who will take the information you give him and he will make a decision. And that just changes an organizational dynamic tremendously. So I've probably said more than I should about our director, but we are just so fortunate to have him. The second element on that chart is our program analysis and evaluation element, and you guys can read the charts, you'll get them. But we're basically the oil for the machine. We help the DHRA community come to grips with priorities. And finally, the corporate governance that our director established is in two pieces. It's a corporate board chaired by our director, staffed by the senior executive service or flag or general officers that are the DHRA component directors. And the guys who roll up their sleeves and do the yeoman work are the senior working group. It's chaired by our deputy director. This is generally at the GS-15 level, and they are the guys who help us develop the requirements, and you'll see a little bit more of their role as I go into the next chart. But those are our primary players. The next chart sort of talks to our process. The first thing we had to do was create a framework, and we already have a framework in terms of our budget line programs. We have about 20 budget programs in our budget that we brief to Congress, congressional staffers, OMB, every year. But those are relatively large programs. Those programs might be $100 million program. So our first attempt, as Karsten was involved with a couple of years ago, was to decompose those programs into a sub-element we called sub-programs. We tried to prioritize those programs. We were able to do that, but what we found was that the sub-programs, the piece parts, were still too big. Too big to make a decision to delete a program. So we ultimately ended up with this concept called MDEPS, management decision packages. I'm responsible for the name because I come from the Army, and the Army has MDEPs. If you are an Army person, please don't confuse these with your MDEPs because they're not. This is not, of course, obviously the DHRA budget is nothing like the Army's budget or any service budget for that matter. But MDEPs were simply a mechanism we used to decompose our programs and subprograms into pieces that we could eliminate from the program or pieces that we could add to the program incrementally. So it gave us a flexibility to deal with budget reductions and those sorts of things. We employed our senior working group to define the MDEPs and explain the MDEPs. And this was a multi-day process to define them, but then we gathered the senior working group together for multiple days so that they could explain their portfolio to their cohorts so that those cohorts would have an understanding of what it is that they do. And I think this was our first step in creating the enterprise perspective. Our next step was to build a model. Karsten helped us immensely in that. We developed criteria. What we would use to evaluate an MDEP. We went through a process. I don't know how much you want me to talk to about this, but we went through a process where we did a pairwise comparison. So one of our criteria might be a legal mandate, and another criteria might be the criticality of impact of that particular MDEP. And we looked at those two criteria, and we had to decide which one was more important to us and to what degree it was more important. And it's just a process that these guys took us through so that we ended up, from my perspective, with a model that had coefficients and variables that we could then place values on so that we could then put it into the model so that we could generate an initial look at a prioritized listing of the elements that comprised our portfolio. We then went through a sensitivity analysis, and it was different from sensitivity analyses that I've done in the past. In the past, we'd simply say, well, that doesn't look at the bottom. We might want to move that MDEP up. And it was more an analysis where we looked at the score that the MDEP had, and then we looked at the model, and we really tried to see whether we needed to adjust the factors in the model to change where the MDEP may appear in the list of priorities, as opposed to just sort of a priori just moving things around. We felt that was actually a more supportable way to get things done, and I think it helped us get buy-in to the final product. We presented the results to our board of directors. Ultimately, they approved those results, and then that was presented to the Under for Personnel and Readiness. I don't want to talk too much Department of Defense here, but we produced something called a Program Objective Memorandum. It basically lays out what we want to do with our resources over our budget year and 5 program years. And that Program Objective Memorandum has to go to the Under for Personnel and Readiness for approval. So part of that Program Objective Memorandum, for the first time for this cycle, included a prioritization of what we had done as a result of the MDEP work. So that was kind of a first for us, and I think it was a pretty proud moment for us to be able to do that. I'm going to go to the next chart. What did we achieve? I'd say we began to develop an enterprise perspective. We're not there yet, but we did begin to develop an appreciation, I think, for all of our components with what the other components do. I think we generated buy-in to the process. The neat thing about this model and this process is that it sort of takes all the emotion out of things. It helps you simply grade something based upon a set of criteria, and see what the outcome is. And I'll talk a little bit about where we went with that in just a second. But before I get there, I think we did achieve transparency. We didn't do anything behind closed doors. We did achieve inclusiveness or inclusion, whatever the right word is. Everybody that was involved in this, that had a stake in the claim, participated. We did develop a process that is repeatable. We came up with a list of 1 to N of what our priorities were. We found out that probably wasn't the most politically feasible thing to present to people, because they automatically migrate to the bottom of the list. So we broke our list into quintiles, top 20%, into quintiles. So the focus is really on the bottom 20% as opposed to a specific MDEP within that 20%. So it sort of gives flexibility to the leadership to go into that bottom 20% and maybe identify something, if we have to reduce, something that we need to reduce that may not be at the bottom of the list, but may be the right thing to reduce. And I'll talk about a little bit of that on the last chart. We also addressed something we called must-fund MDEPs. And we had a little trouble with that concept. Everybody wanted their MDEP to be must-fund. It's not like that. Not everything is a must-fund. So we had to deal with that criterion a little bit. So where we ended up was, if there was a legal mandate that said do something specifically what we were doing, that was a must-fund MDEP. So the law says that we must do a survey of the service academies for sexual assault prevention and response every year. That's a must-do. That went into the must-do column. It was in the top quintile. It's something that DHRA has to do. However, there's also legislation that says tells us what to do but not how to do it. And that sort of was a middle ground where it wasn't a legal mandate to do it specifically, so it was not a must-do thing, but it was something that we had to do, and we had chosen a different way to do that. So it was not necessarily a top-tier MDEP. So that's sort of what we felt we achieved. The last slide sort of talks to where do we go from here. I think we have a good first cut on understanding of what comprises the MDEPs and what our set of MDEPs are. We've got about 300 of them. I think we're going to get better at defining them, and I suspect that the actual number will go down, although I don't know that. We've learned that we need to be able to optimize. We need to optimize our resourcing decisions. That's a next step for us. We realized in the process that our MDEPs had interdependencies, and we hadn't really captured that. That's a next step. And then we sort of need to expand our perspective to involve our Chief Information Officer, our comptroller, our human resources director. We just need to broaden our perspective. I'm a neophyte at this, so I'm going to just ask these folks. There are questions on the board? Later. Okay. Okay. Then I think I will speak no more forever and turn it over to Karsten.
Thanks, Jim. That's an excellent deep dive into a specific process. And all I'm going to do now, before we get to some of those questions, is give a little bit of a overarching set of comments, a handful of slides here. I am glad, by the way, you talked about that must fund. Just to conclude your portion here is, we see that idea of having to assess elements of a portfolio, again, programs or investments, against some degree of regulatory forcing function, and we see that being a challenge for a lot of organizations. And I think I'm glad you described the way that you took that and really looked hard at that question, because what you're able to do in those cases where you say, well, what is really a legal mandate and what are we absolutely constrained to put into that must-do column, and where might we have some opportunities to modify or adjust the portfolio. The more you can do that, the more you can explore other ways of course, achieving those regulatory requirements, but maybe there's different ways to do that. That just gives you more opportunities to, again, find optimal solutions. It gives you more, so to speak, trade space to work within. So we see that as a challenge across the base of organizations that we work with. So I appreciate you touching on that. I am going to move on just again for a few minutes here before we get to some questions on not necessarily a comprehensive set of comments, but hopefully touching on some key themes. And there'll certainly be some consistency with what Jim mentioned. Strategic planning and the development of these processes, it is absolutely a journey. You heard Jim's description of their ongoing journey. It is an evolution. And with our experience supporting federal agencies, and again, those in other industries as well, we've honed in on three, I would say, key areas that are really at the core of success. And these relate to and are in the context of improving in terms of your organizational maturity. And I'll explain what that means here. So if you look at this slide and you think about these three areas: process, governance. You heard Jim talk quite a bit about the governance element, and of course data. If you pick apart your planning issues, so many come down to these fundamental and core issues. So on the top row of the matrix that you see, it indicates an increasing progression in maturity from ad hoc, much less developed, to ultimately an optimized level. And the bullets within the matrix are simply some examples of the types of indicators that could represent the level of maturity indicated in that particular column. And we offer this to help you ask the questions and sort of self-assess. Where are you today? And we often work through customers with an exercise like this. Where would you like to be? What areas are a priority for your organization? For example, do you know in a self-aware moment that your organization may be not as strong as you want to be in terms of process? If you look at your data, is that data of some questionable quality? Do you know you need to revalidate or refresh or improve that data? And thinking about this another way, sort of from the flip side, if it's helpful, and given the audience on the phone, these statements may resonate with some folks out there. If you're challenged with some of these aspects, you may ask the question, well, what if I don't have process or good process? Well, you're likely experiencing a frustrating process, and these things can just sort of stall. What if you don't have governance or good governance? So that's probably like the Wild West. And it's hard to get the organization and its interests aligned, which is so important to that enterprise view. And your executives are probably experiencing some significant frustration. And lastly, in terms of data, what if I don't have data or don't have data that I view as good or valid? It's probably hard to generate any sense of priority among those programs or investments. Briefly on this point about data, because this is a common dynamic that we see, and just worth the general observation. You may have aspirations of clear and complete quantitative data, but you may not be there yet, and that's okay. That can be an evolution. If that's the case, you can assess your investments or your programs using the expertise of your organization. As qualitative as those assessments may be, and the fact that you're reaching out to your organizational experts to gain those qualitative inputs, and I'll explain that in a moment. But it still gives you a common framework against which to evaluate and compare, and that can be, in and of itself, such an advance forward for the beginning and setting the foundation for these processes. So if I give an example, if I'm looking at performance as an element or a criterion, an attribute that is important to evaluating these programs or investments, you may aspire to have quantitative data. You don't have it yet. Again, in the interim, use a qualitative scale for your organization, your experts to assess excellent at one end of the spectrum and poor at the other, with elements in between. And again, in many cases, just the establishment of a common objective framework is a huge step forward. And I think, again, Jim talked to that certainly to a degree. Again, before moving on, an overarching comment, something that touches across these elements, it is very important to understand the cultural receptivity to change. This slide is a fairly straightforward list. You heard, again, Jim touch on several of these, particularly the first one. I'm just going to offer just a couple of additional comments. I can't emphasize enough when these factors, these are, again, from our observations, really key to successful implementation of these processes. When these are addressed, the likelihood of establishing a successful foundation is drastically improved. Clear executive guidance and rudder orders at various stages. You heard Jim talk to that. Process owners, the person in charge of driving the process through all the wickets and the milestones, really being seen by the organization as the clear lead, with empowered and with a clear mandate, so the organization can be responsive to those process demands. A core team identified early, that's a small group. Again, they're really part of that driving the process and often the socialization and education of the organization. Data, we've talked about it, we'll continue to talk about it. It is a journey in and of itself. Checking and validating your data, cleaning it up, taking opportunities to ensure that it is refreshed and up to date, and making sure as well that the data elements that you pull in really are helping to inform your most important questions. Is the data that you're collecting really all critical to helping you make those decisions? And those may be some things you can revisit. I'll keep moving on again to get some time for some questions. Just an example of some things, again, not a comprehensive list, but a set of things to think about as you consider and as you're leading into a new process. If I look at some key elements here in the first bullet, setting targets. Think in terms of process. Are you able to move through a full cycle? When I think of that, I think in terms of sort of a decision lens process where we're ultimately getting to a resource optimization. You heard Jim talk about that as an aspiration. Can you get through that in one cycle? Is it more realistic that you get to a prioritized list? Is the idea of an objective framework and a 1 to N, we heard that term a lot, and a prioritized list of investments? Is that your objective for the first cycle, and then evolving through multiple subsequent cycles? Another target, again, that idea of maturity and organizational maturity. Is governance, for example, a really important area of improvement? So setting those targets up front are very important. We'll continue to emphasize the idea of a core team, identifying that group early, representatives from really key stakeholders, and ideally an analyst or two to help with the data that you're assessing. In terms of data, that middle bullet there, this is more reference to the information about your programs and investments that you're gathering. Do you have a common template? Do you have a clear description? This is, again, points to Jim's comments as well about educating the organization. So those descriptions need to be clear, and in terms of communicating information to those that may not be as familiar with those other investments. That data could include important categories for grouping programs, investments, cost data, etc. Decision points, this next bullet, the idea that you want to think forward, of course, and this is a natural, again, hopefully fairly straightforward, but these things matter. What are the visuals, reports, analytics that would be useful at each stage and each key decision point or milestone of your process? And lastly, of course, again, we've touched on it in several different ways, measuring your programs. The benefit of taking a more quantitative approach, there's some metric that you can associate with that particular attribute or question that you're asking. That can be a very simple sort of data import. The benefits of more qualitative assessment measures is that you're really engaging your subject matter experts to provide that expertise. This can often be lost, and we see this with organizations where those measures are not addressed, and it's in people's heads, it's based on their years of experience. Try to tap into that and leverage it. And in many cases, a blend of those two types of measurement systems, these criteria, that can be very, very effective and something that's new and helpful. Leaving you with just a handful of key takeaways. You can do this. We listed some common challenges. The good news, they're known. They are absolutely, you can work through those. It takes some patience, certainly, some persistence, and an organization, but you can do it. An obvious statement in the second bullet, but I think it is worth, again, re-emphasizing the idea that disciplined planning processes go a long way, and nailing this down can really help you set your best foot forward. Inclusivity, you heard Jim talk about that as well, working with your managers and engaging them in the dialogue. It's about really bringing the right people into your process at the right time, a core team at the beginning to drive, to develop the framework really and drive that process forward. Executive level or board or steering committee groups to approve that framework, subject matter experts to weigh in on the programs or investments and evaluate those, and then ultimately resource decision makers to work through the development and the iteration of resource decision options, trade-offs, etc. And lastly, and again, I think this is something worth ending on because it is absolutely a core understanding and a part of organizational learning. This is evolution. It's one of the most important messages to take away. So again, if you need to take this slow, figure out what you can accomplish in that first cycle. What are your stretch goals? What is something you'd aspire to in a second cycle? In a second or third cycle, look at those lessons learned, refine your messaging, your timeline, your framework. And as you go through those cycles, you will see increasing buy-in from your organization, reduced pushback, and people will be more excited to engage and push that process through because they are included, they're involved, and you'll be rocking and rolling. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much, Matt. And again, we're always here to help.
Super. Thanks, Karsten. Thanks, Jim. We did get a couple of questions, but before I hop into them, I do have one of mine. Karsten, you listed a few times that the desire, the openness for change is so important, the culture of change, an environment of change. And so my question for you is a little bit, Jim, how did DHRA, what was the culture of change like there? Where was it open to try and redo a planning process with 9 disparate groups and a new director? And, was the change willingness around there, or was that an obstacle in the end?
Surprisingly, it was a fertile environment. I think people want to know that there's some rigor to how we make decisions on what we say is most important and least important. And people don't like methods like salami slicing a reduction or something like. People like to be involved, and I guess that's one of the big surprises we had in this effort was that our senior working group were just champing at the bit to be involved in a process that did this. So that was that was pretty encouraging thing.
You say it's surprising, but I would say it's probably one of the reasons you guys have had a good start and a good early success on getting through this. I mean, I think it's what I've seen that openness to change is just huge, and clearly you had it with an executive sponsor.
Yes.
All right, we did get a few questions. One of them was preceded by this, which I know will make Jim happy, but it's going to hurt Karsten if I know his background. It said the first part of his question was, "Go Army, beat Navy."
Okay.
I don't think that's a question, but okay.
Knowing Karsten's background, that's not going to start there. His question actually was, or her question, my apologies, was, how or if did you capture the entire organization's resource throughput to have total capacity when planning? So again, the view was, did you have an idea of capacity, what people could do, or were you looking at really just prioritizing since everything was going to get done?
I think I understand the question. What our first shot at this was to just prioritize what we knew. So this wasn't zero-based and an identification of everything we wanted to do. It was constrained by the dollars that we had and the manpower that we had within our resources. So it wasn't unconstrained. I hope I'm answering the question.
Yeah.
We knew what our limits were. Obviously, that sort of begs the question. Well, is that what you want in the future? No, we want to be more like the services in terms of prioritizing everything we do and basically drawing an affordability cut line, and then you got stuff below the line and above the line, and then you can adjust based upon whether you get additional resources or whether resources are taken away. So, as I said at the outset, we've only just begun. We think it's a good first cut, but we got lots we want to do, and we're pretty stoked about getting to do it.
And just to add my 2 cents to the question, I think it's a very common again, maturation process as well. You got to start by laying out a strategic direction. What will our criteria be for even analyzing priority before we get anywhere near capacity planning and really making the hard optimization of resources there? So not a common maturation. We got another question, and this was about the development of the criteria. Who was included and at what level were they in developing the criteria? And was there general consensus from across the leadership, or was it, and I'll add my 2 cents to it, or was it a bit of contentious as it went through that?
Interestingly enough, the model itself was developed by our board. So we had senior executive service and general officers, flag officers engaged in determining what the criteria were. I did not think that it was antagonistic at all. I mean, we sort of, I'll be honest, we sort of tried that with the senior working group, and I don't want to say something negative here, but I don't think they had the same enterprise perspective that the general officers did. Their breadth of perspective still was in their silo, yeah. And I think we made progress to address that, but the SESs, the flag officers, the general officers were above that, and it was well, Karsten sort of facilitated the meeting, and it was fun to watch the way those guys think, first of all, and how they weren't parochial, how they did have an enterprise perspective. So I think that's one of the great successes of the initiative, was that we had the very senior leadership in DHRA built the model, so therefore they bought into the
That's
model.
huge. I think you showed maturation there. You learned by working with all the different stakeholders at all levels where the model needed to be built for best success.
Yeah. Yes.
You did some experimentation, you saw some problems, you saw some less than enterprise focus, to use your word, and I think that you found the right spot, and that shows a good path in the journey as well. We had one sort of short, factual question. Could the speaker clarify if budget line program is equivalent to PPA or a level above or below? Does that question make sense to you?
Well, I don't know what PPA means. A budget line program is a line item in our budget. So it might be the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office. That might be a $20 million line item in our budget. Our budget will describe what that office does, and of course our budget will include any discussion of whether resources are increased or decreased from the past. But so budget line program means Congress sees it. It means the public sees it. It means it's a description of I'll use one of the major muscle groups within DHRA.
Makes sense.
That's the best I can do. I don't know what a
That's
PPA
perfect. And if
is.
that person who asked the question, if that didn't answer your question, feel free to email us directly or another question there, and we'll get you an answer for sure. All right, so then we've got about time for just one quick one more. It's a question that I think was a great one that came in. Jim, do you have any words of advice for people out there who may be starting a new process like this?
It's funny. When I got here today, I was talking to Karsten. I may get a little choked up with this about a guy named Jimmy Valvano, and he was the coach of the NC State basketball team in the 80s. He died of cancer several years ago, and he made this impassioned speech at an ESPN awards ceremony where he just kept saying, and he was fighting cancer at the time, don't give up. Don't ever give up. And I guess if I could impart one thing, it is part of what I talked about was starting this journey in 2010. And we want, those of us who came into DHRA from the services said, this is a glaring omission. We need to have something like this. And we just couldn't get the traction to get there until we got executive leadership who wanted us to get there. And then, that's like the dam burst, and everything sort of fell into place there. But don't give up.
Yeah.
Don't ever give up.
And get started. I think what
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
implicitly saying is
Yeah,
don't wait for you to feel like there's a perfect
Right.
environment to go ahead and
Right.
get started.
Right.
I mean, get started
Right.
with what you got
Right.
and improve as you go.
Right. Right.
That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
That's really great. All right. Well, look, I appreciate both of you joining us today, and I appreciate all of you who joined us on the phone today. On the screen in front of you are a couple of you got the email addresses for Jim and for Carson. If you have any questions or direct follow-ups with them, you should feel free to reach out to them directly. And then you've got our public sector solutions page there for Decision Lens, which you should feel free to get out there and give a check on as well. If we didn't get to your question, we will get you an answer. And if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, go ahead and email one of us and we'll try to get at it as fast as we can. And again, we appreciate all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you on our next event, probably in October. Thanks all and have a great day.